Business Line News Podcast. I'm Nivedita Varadarajan and this is News Explained. Over the past week, we have seen several important developments in Afghanistan. The Taliban has stormed the capital Kabul and has seized power. With this, the 2 decades of the American war on terrorism has come to a very futile end. There are two big issues at play here. One, why they left, and the other, how they left. Why they left is a very simple question to answer. It is because the war has been extremely unpopular in the US. Three presidents have tried to leave Afghanistan: George Bush Jr., Barack Obama, and Trump, and only Biden has been successful. Biden has been credited for completing a long standing agenda and not kicking the can to the next president to solve the issue. And many have praised him in the US for doing so. The second part, the one on how they left, is the one that has caused many a worry. Critics of the US government say that the Americans left in a hurry and they did so at the cost of the Afghan people. They say the government placed their trust in Taliban, which is a known terrorist organization, an organization they came to control in the war, and they left without any guarantees for the people, and they didn't even talk to the Afghan government before they left. On the 22nd of July, I spoke to Observer Research Foundation's Kriti Shah on the various players and the factors there. What has happened since then? How did the situation degrade so much? And how did the government fall so fast? What is going to happen in Afghanistan next? Kriti Shah joins us today to help us understand more about the topic. Thank you so much for joining us, Kriti. So, when we spoke last, we were talking about how the Afghan government was giving a pushback, was fighting against the Taliban. What happened?
Things have got really bad really fast, and I don't think anyone anticipated on how soon things would get so bad. And this is partially because what was Taliban's military strategy, which we now understand in hindsight. Last time we had spoken, I was talking about how their strategy has been to sort of capture rural areas, seize control of large areas, and then move towards the provincial capitals. They have been doing that, but that allowed them to sort of gain control over major highways. So once they made it to the capital, even if they were fighting the Afghan forces in the capital, the Afghan forces were cut off from getting reinforcements, from their supply routes, new ammunition not coming in. So like we saw in a number of cases, the Afghan forces had to sort of just surrender or flee. And that got them a lot of bad press. But this was the real situation, that the Taliban's military strategy was exactly this. And this led to a domino effect, which is that one district falls, and then the other district falls, and then the other district falls. And people know that the Taliban are coming, and they sort of find it futile to fight when they know that the possibility of defeat is higher. Another reason why the government fell so fast is when we look at it in terms of the Ashraf Ghani government, there was confusion in terms of how quickly Ghani was interested in changing different ministers, be it the defense minister, be it interior minister, the military chief, different provincial police chiefs or police chiefs in different parts of the country. And all of that sort of affects the battlefield performance, because they had to be a united force and know that their government is standing behind them. But now we know that wasn't the case, because there was little unity of command, and the leadership was established. The leadership established in order to fight that sort of gets eroded with all this sort of political interference which came from the government. And how you said that we believed last time that there were cases of the Afghan forces sort of pushing back and fighting the Taliban. But on a large scale, of course, that did prove extremely futile, because those were just small cases. And while they did not receive any press, given the widespread sort of corruption in the defense forces, senior commanders sort of taking money for themselves, pocketing different salaries, selling guns on the black market, all of these reasons, the Taliban's military strategy, political interference, and problems with the Afghan forces, all of them sort of collectively led to the situation getting so bad so fast.
One major criticism the Afghan government faces quite a lot is that they did not have the will to fight. But then the thing is that the Americans were also deeply involved in planning and strategy. So where did the Americans go wrong then?
Oh, well, the Americans went wrong on a lot of fronts, because yes, they knew they had to leave. And they focused simply on sort of taking their soldiers and their personnel in the country out in a staggered manner. But what they did not anticipate was, of course, things getting bad so fast, and they didn't have a contingency plan. So all the sort of horrific, but now yet historic visuals and videos and photographs that we see on social media, people leaving the US embassy, US people clinging on to US planes, they should have planned for that in advance, and they didn't do that. I think it was August 8th or something like that when someone asked Biden about the situation in Afghanistan, and he said there's Taliban coming to power in Kabul is very unlikely, so that's not going to happen. So it was, of course, a major intelligence failure. Initially, they had said, "Oh, it will take 4 months," and they had said, "Oh, it might be sooner than that." And even just a week before everything went extremely bad, they still didn't grasp the seriousness of the situation, and they didn't have any contingency plans in place, not only for Americans, but even the Afghans that have worked with the US through the 20 years, translators, interpreters, women's rights activists. They didn't have any plan for them. And that not only has led to terrible PR and visuals, which is going to haunt the rest of the world forever, but has also caused a lot of grief for the Afghans.
One of the things which was more surprising to me is the way the president left Afghanistan. What role can they play now, seeing that they are not in Afghanistan? What can they do to contribute further, contribute in the fight against the Taliban?
I really think it's unlikely that Ashraf Ghani is going to have ever any role in the political future of Afghanistan. Whatever little goodwill the people had for him vanished just like that the moment the news broke. And that's not only the people of Afghanistan, but even the people in his own government, which he selected. Because when they heard the news, the shock that came to them that he sort of fled the coup was, of course, extremely devastating. So I think Ghani is done, and he doesn't have any political future in Afghanistan.
I
Of
kind
course,
of I kind
yeah,
of understand why he left. I mean, because the last time when the Taliban came, it did not end very well for the leadership at that time. So one
sure.
can't blame him for leaving. But what
Yeah,
can, yeah, what
yeah, no,
can,
I understand. It's the fear of, being the president and having the Taliban literally knocking on your doors is going to cause you so much anxiety and fear that you would want to leave the country.
yeah,
And yet, you are the president of the country, and you're not the only one who's scared. The entire country is in the midst of this horror movie that they never thought would happen. So they're not only fearful about, our government let us down, but knowing, yes, our government let us down, and now our president he's completely safe. He has flown away and he's okay. So it was just him and his core group which flew away. But there was still a lot of political leaders like Vice President Amrullah Saleh who remained in the country
he's
and
still
are
there.
ready.
He's still
He's
there.
still there. Absolutely. And he's saying, I think it was yesterday that he said that the
He's going
Afghan
to be the
constitution,
caretaker president.
yes, that he is technically the caretaker president and that he's sort of, mounting this resistance. Now, how successful that will be, I don't know. But that gives so much hope to the Afghan people to know that our leaders have not deserted us. And they are, yes, they might be as afraid as us, but they're still here and they're still at least attempting to protect us against the Taliban. So I think Ashraf Ghani made a emotional choice that's going to majorly cost not only his political future, but has also led to the situation that we see today because the Taliban could just simply walk in. But other political leaders we've seen, like Hamid Karzai, just met with the Taliban, I think a few hours ago. Abdullah, and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who's actually a former terrorist from the 90s, they're sort of seeing on what sort of coordination or what sort of agreement they can reach with the Taliban now. And I suspect the Taliban will be eager at some level to accommodate some of these political actors. Not Saleh, of course, not Amrullah Saleh, because he's been one of the harshest critics of the Taliban, but people like Karzai and Abdullah, actors that have always been opposed to Ashraf Ghani, actors that have strong relations with regional countries that are not on best of terms with the United States. And the Taliban would sort of want to work with them just so that they can project that they have this inclusive government, that they're listening to different stakeholders. So while Ghani is completely done, there's still political leaders in the country that are attempting to determine the fate of the country.
Just like Ghani left, many people also millions of Afghanistanis want to leave. And what struck me was the pictures and reports of people fleeing. And when we were looking at this, the European leaders, Macron, Angela Merkel, they all came out and said we need to contain the refugee crisis in the region. Where will they go to? They can't go to Turkmenistan or Tajikistan. Tajikistan did not even allow Ghani to come in. There's no scope of them allowing everyday Afghans to come in. Pakistan's not going to let them in. Iran is in a crisis. Where will they go?
Well, I have no idea because unfortunately, I think that the people who really have to escape will end up making it to Pakistan or Iran only because the US and the EU especially have just been focused on getting their people, their diplomatic staff, and the small group of Afghans that work with them with their armies or their embassies. They've been focused on just getting them out of the country, and they do not care for the everyday Afghans, women, children, men at all. And ever since the Syrian refugee crisis of 2015, the EU, of course, as we know, they've sort of tightened their migration laws and they've made it more difficult for people to come to it and seek asylum in the EU. In fact, in 2015, I think Afghans at that time were the second largest group of people that were fleeing to the EU after the Syrians.
Yeah.
So while millions might have applied for asylum, at this point, I doubt how much the EU is going to be open to Afghans coming in. And that's extremely worrying. So we do have an imminent refugee crisis that is on our hands, but there's no clarity in terms of who is going to allow them to come in. Different countries might have certain numbers that they put in. I think Canada has done that. India is trying to facilitate certain Hindus and Sikhs to come to India.
Uganda is taking people on behest of America. It's the third largest refugee caretaker in the world, which is surprising to me. It's a thing I found out yesterday, and I'm really surprised. Kudos for you.
No, so I mean, it's extremely distressing. But like we were talking about earlier, these are things that the EU and the US should have planned for in advance when they knew that they are leaving, when they knew that there's a prospect of the Taliban not just coming to power in its entirety, but at least getting into some sort of power sharing agreement. They would have had to know that they have a migration crisis on their hands. And what can they do now? What sort of legislation could they have passed before that would have eased at least specific groups of people, at least women rights activists whose lives are literally under threat, or just larger groups of people? They could have planned for this earlier, but they didn't. So things are going to get bad. And unfortunately, there's not much being done to sort of contain that.
US President Joe Biden said that the US was not interested in fighting and dying in another war. NSA Jake Sullivan basically blamed Afghanistan for not having the will to fight. Will USA come back again if they're not coming? It's a loaded question. Will they ever come back? I think they might.
I do not think they're coming back. I do not think they should come back. What has happened in Afghanistan sort of is just major. The only way to describe it in terms of the US is superpower humiliation.
Yeah.
There is nothing for them left in Afghanistan. The people of Afghanistan know that the US has betrayed us the way they left. They might have made a lot of gains over 20 years, and the Afghan people might thank them for that. They understand also
eventually, but that's all gone now.
It's all up in the air. There's such a huge threat to it. So while they might be initially grateful for the US getting them to a certain point, the manner in which they left is just absolutely horrible. So I don't think at all that the US will be going back into Afghanistan. And even the response in the US to it has been so mixed. It's become a partisan issue where people have been criticizing Biden and supporting Biden. But Biden has just been sort of blaming the Afghan leaders. He's been saying that American troops are not going to go and die in a war when Afghan forces are not willing to fight themselves. So these are great. I mean, these are statements which appeal to a domestic audience in the US, and it's understandable that he's saying that. But even in his speech, there was no mention of the suffering of Afghans. There was no mention. Absolutely, there was no mention of the threat that women face. So the entire situation is going to be so bad for the US in terms of their interests elsewhere in the world as well, that I'm very sure that they're not going to come back ever.
Here's another loaded question for you. Does this whole Afghan event mark the downfall of the US as a superpower?
Well, yeah, that's a tough one because I think, I mean, the United States is still, one of the most powerful countries in the world. But I think the situation in Afghanistan is just one instance of it sort of rethinking its foreign policy regarding foreign intervention, or sort of believing that they can go into different countries and nation build. Or apparently, Joe Biden said they were not trying to nation build in Afghanistan. So I think
20
it
years
will.
too late.
Yeah, too late. Absolutely. I think that's definitely going to lead to a foreign policy rethink on what is the US's foreign interests, and how can they best meet that interest without a large military presence. So who are its allies in the region that they can trust? What are the sort of regional groupings that they can give more responsibility to take care of the Afghanistan situation? So as for a superpower, I don't know, but it is definitely extremely humiliating what has happened, and it will force them to rethink. I really hope it does force them to rethink it's the decisions that they've made in Afghanistan and the larger region.
Moving a little closer to Afghanistan, there's one player who's a major player who has been quite silent so far, the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Countries. Why are they quiet?
I think people are just trying to see how things shape up, because it's still very early days to get an idea of what sort of government the Taliban will form. What are the sort of regional countries that will, recognize the Taliban government? So even Pakistan, surprisingly, has not recognized the Taliban government yet,
But Pakistan
and
is
they've
very
been.
happy about them, right? Imran Khan said they're breaking the shackles of colonialism.
Oh, absolutely. Pakistan's extremely happy because in the Taliban's victory is actually a victory for Pakistan. They have wanted this for so long. And even in their wildest dreams, they would not have believed
Yeah,
that the Taliban would come to power in Kabul entirely on its own, not in a power sharing agreement, nothing which is negotiated, but
just walk
literally
right in,
handed
right?
over, absolutely handed over the keys to the presidential palace and just walked on in. So this is, Pakistan's just, it just, I mean, they're rejoicing. They're absolutely rejoicing. And when you sort of look beyond that and you try to, talk to Pakistanis on social media, which is a very bad idea. But if you do that and you try to understand the reason for their sort of happiness, they say, oh, it's not about so much the Taliban coming to power as much as it is the defeat of the US in our backyard. So they've been sort of trying to project it like that, but they've been absolutely jubilant. And they've been sort of trying to, show that, the Taliban has changed. They're saying they're going to make an inclusive government. There are so many women, there are instances of women reporting on TV. So they're trying to show that, why were you thinking that Taliban rule is going to be so bad? Look, these guys aren't so bad. All these liberals were thinking that this is what's going to happen. So they've been sort of trying to fuel that ridiculous delusional image that the Taliban haven't changed. But yeah, they've been very happy.
Then there's the question of the United Nations and what the UNSC is doing. What are they doing? They've been very quiet too.
I don't know what the UN can do. They have just made statements. They have made their typical statements like they do, that we cannot abandon Afghanistan, that the international community must work together, we must unite, we must ensure that Afghanistan is not used as a safe haven against terrorists. But there's literally not much that they can do. And their statements have been, not surprising really. They've just been really diplomatic. And I think they're also just trying to see how different countries in the region, what is the process with which they begin to legitimize the government and recognize the government. But there's nothing that the UN can do as usual. It's all statements, it's more talk, less action. So that's just been, the first few days, that's all that they can really say.
India is in a very difficult, interesting position, I would say, because India heads the UNSC right now. What can India do? What can India do in its special role? So it's a role that India doesn't have quite often. So what can India do in this special role?
So I think it's ironic that India has this position at this moment, and I think
Yeah.
what India has been trying to do is simply ensure that Afghanistan stays on the agenda and that everyone is watching Afghanistan very closely, and that's happening anyway. But that Afghanistan stays on the agenda of the UN Security Council. So just to monitor how things unfold. See, this is all still early. It's been less than a week, so we don't know how things are going to pan out. But just watching things very deliberately and watching things very closely to see what happens. It can't really advocate for the Afghans' interests at this point because India is the only one who's been advocating for Afghanistan's interests until now. But there's not much that they can do, given that the Taliban are so powerful, and that given that India also now
Everyone is legitimizing them.
everyone's legitimizing them, and India is also now forced to rethink that our worst possible scenario in Afghanistan is coming true, and what is it that we need to do as a country first with our relations with Afghanistan. So I mean, it's a complicated situation, but I'm very pessimistic about what sort of role the UN can play, at least in the short term. In the long term, if the Taliban begin continuing the same practices that they did in the 90s, of course the talk of sanctions and all of that will come in later.
And
But right
US
now,
will eventually come in, I'm sure. I'm 90% sure. 20 years
yeah,
down the line, we'll have the same conversation.
yeah, absolutely. So it's sort of everyone's just sort of waiting and watching, seeing how things will unfold, and then sort of deciding what's the next step for them.
So, how will all this regional instability affect India? One thing many people are pointing out is that Kashmir, we can see a rise in insurgency activity in Kashmir because I think I saw a graph on Twitter the other day which showed in the 80s there was a lot of violence in Kashmir, and they said that that's because of Taliban, which was a strong force in the neighborhood, and they're
Yeah.
predict that will come back because Taliban's in control again.
Yeah. So the Taliban had made a statement some time ago when they had asked about what their relationship with India would be like and what their policy on Kashmir would be. And the Taliban had said that, we don't interfere in the internal matters of other nations. Not that we should be going to believe the Taliban at any time soon, but they're sort of trying to act as this, quote unquote, responsible power that doesn't interfere in the matters of other nations. But yes, there can be a blowback in Kashmir because there have been reports of, Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba working alongside Taliban fighters in training camps in Afghanistan. So they could expand their training facilities, learn more military tactics, and that could have a potential blowback in Kashmir. When the Taliban had made that statement regarding Kashmir, it really upset Pakistan because here they were thinking that they have, nurtured this group in Afghanistan. They have, they want to get that strategic depth in Afghanistan so that they can continue their attacks in Kashmir, and then not being able to do that. But I'm sure that Pakistan will encourage it and push for it to see how its groups that are active in Kashmir, what sort of things can they learn from the Taliban, and how they can continue fighting in Kashmir. But for India, it's also on a more geopolitical and on a larger level. The Taliban's power in Afghanistan is also worrying because it means that ties between, of course, Pakistan, the Taliban, and now China are going to grow. So that means that two of India's so-called biggest rivals are going to be having a larger footprint that's going to be steadily expanding in a country that India has a large stake in and that India has investments in. So that's extremely worrying for India as well.
Speaking of Pakistan and the lack of Pakistan and the Taliban also have friction points. It's not like they don't have friction points, right? For one, Taliban doesn't recognize the Durand line.
Mm-hmm.
So how will that happen?
So one of the main reasons for Pakistan's support for the Taliban has been one is, of course, Pakistan's desire to gain this so-called strategic depth, which means that, we can have more space in Afghanistan, which would allow us, in event of a military confrontation with India, to use Afghan territory in our fight against India. But they have also wanted to appease the Taliban, which at the start was predominantly Pashtun, so that if they're on their side, they stop making claims for a larger area across the Durand line or the Afghan Pak border for the so-called land called Pashtunistan. So I think Taliban know that bringing up Pashtunistan with Pakistan is sort of a sore point. But the thing is, the issue isn't that. The issue is that Taliban can already use the Pashtun majority areas of Pakistan as their own land. Their
And
families
create
live there.
instability in Pakistan.
Absolutely. So their families live there. They have their training camps over there. So for the Taliban, they can just very easily cross over the border at any time, as they have been doing. And that land is not technically, but Pakistan has allowed them to believe that this land is also theirs, that they can use in order to wage their insurgency in Afghanistan. So I don't think this issue is going to come up because it's already very easy for them.
What about terrorism in the larger sense in not only South Asia but in the Western Asia also? We already know that USA and the rest of the world has had issues with ISIS. How will this instability here play out with relation to the Western Asian regions, with the Western Asian countries?
So I think Taliban play an important role in this because a lot of China's reaching out to the Taliban, Russia's reaching out to the Taliban, Iran's outreach to the Taliban have been centered around the Taliban acting as sort of an opposition or a bulwark against the Islamic State. So Iran has been worried about the Islamic State and has thought that why don't we use the Taliban, one, to fight the US in our backyard, but also to use the Taliban in order to prevent the Islamic State from attacking us. And that's been the same thing with Russia, which has wanted to protect the Central Asian republics. So in terms of the larger region, people will see the Taliban initially, at least as they've been seeing it so far, that the Taliban will prevent the growth of the Islamic State. But what it could also mean is that given how successful the Taliban have been, it is definitely also going to sort of boost the morale of militants, jihadists, and terrorists all over the subcontinent once they see the Taliban success, and sort of have their own idea of how the Taliban have come to political power. So the Islamic State is still an international organization that it has different sort of branches of franchises in different parts of the world. But the Taliban is limited, and it has always been limited only to Afghanistan. So I believe it might just sort of inspire jihadists to relook at what their objectives are and compare that to the Taliban and see how they have been so successful.
So you're afraid that they're going to learn the wrong lesson of just wait it out, the US and NATO will get bored at one point and leave?
Well, of course, what's happened will definitely show that NATO and the US alliance, or any alliance with the United States, is not something that can always be there, and it's not always strong. It is fragile. So that's one thing, that people will not trust the US. But it will also lead to sort of this glorification of political Islam, depending on how the Taliban form their government. And that will inspire different groups that seek to establish a so-called Islamic State. This might not be ISIS, but like an Islamic state, an Islamic society. And they see how has the Taliban done that, and sort of seek inspiration from that and apply it in their own country.
You use the words trust in the United States. That's an important thing for me, because many nations across the world use that trust as something, it's like, say, take Taiwan, for example. They use that trust in the United States to counter China. What are the lessons that can possibly be learned for people in Japan or in Taiwan who are looking at this, and they must be worried, right? Because USA might up and leave once popular opinion changes.
I think the lesson for them is don't trust the United States, or at least question, can we trust the United States? Because I think we had discussed this last time, the United States doesn't lose wars, it loses interest.
Yeah.
So if you no longer serve their strategic interests, or like the case in Afghanistan, they realize that they cannot in any way get the outcome that they want, they will leave. So I think this is a lesson for all countries out there who sort of seek protection under the United States sort of military umbrella, not to completely disregard the US's military power, because it still has that strength, but to question it and to know that it is possible that they too can fail. and sort of reevaluate what they want from the US, their alliance with the US then.
Finally, I want to come back to India and India's interest. The Chabahar port in Iran was basically constructed with Iran and India, so we can have an easy access to Afghanistan and sidestep Pakistan. What will happen to the project? It's been very controversial in the past. What could happen to the project?
So there's while Chabahar port is active, it has not progressed as quickly as it should have. And that has largely been because of bureaucratic inefficiencies on part of India and Iran as well, but also because Iran was coming out of Iran. I mean, sanctions were imposed once Trump left the JCPOA nuclear deal.
Yeah.
So I think once a deal is sort of agreed to with the international community and Iran, and once things progress on that part, India, of course, is going to push to use that port as much as it can. Now, it really, I mean, I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, Chabahar, we love to look at it as something which is, alongside the Gwadar port and how we can compete with Pakistan. But it's going to be a long time before the port is operational to the point that India can have very easy access to Afghanistan. It requires, a proper rail system from Chabahar up into northern Iran and then into Afghanistan. Taliban now are in power. They control all the border checkpoints. They control. So now sort of the ball is in the Taliban's court as well to decide what is its sort of relationship with India. It knows that India is interested in this level of trade with Afghanistan. India is also deciding, are we still interested in maintaining that sort of relationship if the Taliban is in power? So I think while Indians were very optimistic and very hopeful about the potential of Chabahar port, while it does hold a lot of potential, it's more long-term potential. Once all the other different moving parts, such as sanctions of Iran, a nuclear deal, a railroad system, a good government in Kabul. So once those things are sort of stabilized, it's only after that can things really get moving.
Thank you, Kriti, for talking to us today. It's been a pleasure talking to you.